Hello everyone. What I'm going to discuss in this lecture is how the different plants that we see now have ultimately evolved from the algae as we discussed in the previous lectures. So what we're going to talk about here is the overall evolution of land plants, focusing on the four main groups, which are bryophytes. These are the earlier plants, the earliest plants, this one right here. Then, so there are also non-vascular type of plants. You see very simple ones, such as, for example, moss, as you're used to see around. Then we'll talk about vascular plants. We first talk about vascular seedless plants, such as ferns, for example. And then we'll talk about the vascular seed plants, which include the gymnosperms, such as, for example, conifers, and angiosperm, which are the flowering plants, those plants that give origin to flower. What I want you to take home here is what are the major changes that happen throughout the evolution of the land plants, from very simple plants just landed through literally that just came from the water, this algae moving to land. How did it go from there all the way to the huge variety and these amazing group of plants, which are angiosperms, which are those plants that basically have conquered the whole world. They are the flowering plants. So what I want you to take home is, first of all, okay, the steps that we already discussed in the last lecture. If you remember, we talked about the challenges that the plants would have had, and so the structure they came up with, the how they came out with something that made them UV resistant, lignin for strength, how they came out with vasculature, roots, stomata, and leaves. So you'll see how these structures start appearing more and more over time throughout the evolution. But most importantly, I want you to focus on how the life cycle and the reproductive efficiency overall has changed over time. And I want you to see how we went from plants that ultimately they used to be mostly in their life cycle, they used to be mostly in the haploid, so gametophyte phase. You see mosses. What you see, what you're used to see as moss is nothing else than the gametophyte, the haploid form. And how with time now the sporophyte becomes more and more and more prevalent, to the point that where you look at conifers or flowering plants, that's what you usually see. You don't see the gametophyte unless you carefully look within the sporophyte. In fact, you get to a point in evolutions where the gametophyte actually is growing attached to the sporophyte, the opposite of what was happening originally, where instead the sporophyte will be growing attached to the gametophyte. You'll see when we talk about mosses, for example. Then another big change that you see throughout evolution is how plants went from being homosporous, so producing only one type of spore, to heterosporous, so two types of spores, where you have the microspores and the megaspores, with the microspores giving origin to male gametophytes, and the macrospore, so the megaspore, sorry, giving origin to the female gametophyte. And this has greatly increased overall by producing plants, producing different type of gametophytes and gametangia, much more variability. So that has led to an increase in mixing of genetic pools, ultimately between different plants. Other things that I want you to keep an eye on is how plants have changed from having sperm dependent on water, such as algae. So the early plants you'll see when we talk about non-vascular and vascular seedless plants, they both had water-dependent sperms. So meaning that these plants, in order to be reproductive, would have to wait for water. So whether it's coming from the lake or from rain, they need water for the sperm to move and fertilize the eggs. Two other plants you'll see when we talk about gymnosperm and angiosperm, these plants, instead of having this water-dependent sperm, now they have an air-dependent sperm, which is still inside a structure which overall is referred to as pollen. We'll talk about that. And which allow them at this point to fertilize plants more efficiently. Right now you have a sperm that to move around doesn't need water anymore. It can fly through the air. Not only that, but by flying it can also spread much farther right? The plants now can colonize larger areas. They can spread much faster to other areas. Not only that, but also they can intermix better. You have pollen that now can migrate. The pollen is the male, like this, it contains the sperm, which now can fertilize the egg from other plants, which may be genetically different, right? You can mix genetic pools with population, making it much more efficient. Another big step, you'll see later on, was the encapsulation of the early embryo into seeds. So as soon as fecundation happens, the sperm, now the airborne sperm, inside the pollen fertilizes the egg. You produce the early embryo. That early embryo doesn't get dropped anymore as is, but is now encapsulated into a seed. This is another big step that I want you to remember, because these allow for these plants to produce embryo that now can wait for favorable conditions to develop into a full plant. A seed now will wait for a certain temperature outside, can wait until a certain temperature, maximizing the chance of survival. And finally, the last step I want you to take in, and you see when we talk about angiosperm, the last group, the flowering plants, how now encapsulating these seeds, so now the early embryos being encapsulated into seeds, but also into fruit. By doing that, now you have also that the seeds can also be spread farther and farther, because the fruit can be ingested by animals, which then, through a mechanism I'm sure you're familiar with, can now spread the seeds, which once were contained into the fruit and don't get digested, into larger areas where they have migrated to or moved around. So these are the major changes I want you to observe throughout the whole lecture. So this is a slide that gives you an idea, I already mentioned this, how the life cycle has changed through evolution. And here you see the life cycle of early plants. Moss, they belong to bryophytes. Bryophytes are non-vascular plants, are among the early type of plants that appear on land. And as you can see, just as generic information, we'll get into details in a few slides, you can see how the diploid form actually lasts for much less time compared to the haploid form. In fact, what you see as moss is this, is the male. So is the haploid, the gametophyte. And then throughout evolution, you go to a point, this is referring to gymnosperms, but is similar to what you would see in angiosperms, so the flowering plants. At this point, instead, the diploid form, the sporophyte, is the one that took over. It's what you look at. You don't look anymore at the gametophyte. This diploid stage, this diploid form, the sporophyte, being diploid is stronger as a type of plant. Not only that, but we'll see also how the gametophyte at this point doesn't even get dropped anymore. It gets kept attached within the sporophyte, within structure, like in this example here, within the cones, the strobili that you find in conifers. Okay, so the life cycle has greatly changed throughout evolution, making plants to be stronger because of their diploid status at this point being prevalent, and also because they can protect now their sperm, their eggs, through pollen and through the structures that stay attached now within the sporophyte, with the gametophyte growing within the sporophyte. So this is a picture I already showed in the other lecture that summarized the evolution of plants, just to remind you. So the first land plants would have appeared on Earth around 500 to 450 million years ago, starting from an ancestral green algae. And these plants would have been fairly similar, and we still have some plants similar to that, which are referred to as non-vascular plants, which are grouped as bryophytes. There are different types, we'll discuss them later on. Then, later on, around 425 million years ago, plants start developing their vascular system. And so we have a group of plants which are referred to as vascular plants that start appearing. Among these groups, we have some plants that are kind of in between bryophytes and vascular seed plants, which are referred to as vascular seedless plants. So these are vascular plants that do not include their early embryo within a seed. And these are plants belonging to these two phyla, lycophytes and pterophytes. We'll talk about that later on. Then, about 360 million years ago, we had finally plants that start producing seeds, encapsulating the early embryo into seeds. So these are referred to as vascular seed plants. And these can be divided into gymnosperms. These are plants that do not encapsulate the seed within flowers, or sorry, with the fruit, and angiosperms that instead they encapsulate the seed within the fruit that comes from the flower that they can produce. All right, so let's start talking about the first group, so the bryophytes here. What are these type of plants? You can see, again, as I mentioned before, these are early plants, early stage land plants. And so these, first of all, they include these groups, these phyla, liverworts. They might have been the first one. Okay, very similar to algae, many properties. Then we have hornworts, and then we have mosses. We focus mostly on mosses on this part. So what are the common properties of all bryophytes? Again, these are early land plants, and so they have a lot of properties of similar to algae overall. First of all, they have very little capacity to control water, so they are referred to as poikilohydric. It's always hard for me to say this word. They tend to be small. The reason why they tend to be small is because they don't have yet a vascular tissue, so they can't really move the nutrients a long distance. So every tissue has to take care of itself. Look at these plants right here. Every single tissue or cell here has to take basically its own nutrients, or they can move very little in between them. So they don't really have vascular tissue. They don't have supporting structures as well, so they don't have lignins, so they can't really grow again very tall. They start having some features that allow them to start managing a little bit of the water. So they start having cuticle and stomata appearing. But in general, they tend to live in areas on wet sites. So very few of them will live in dry environments, but most of them, almost all of them, will live on wet sites. Think about moss, where they grow, for example. Finally, also, they don't have real roots. They only have rhizoids. They have very short stems here, and they don't really have true leaves. These appear like leaves, but in reality, it's just a single layer of epithelium. A leaf would have a vascular tissue inside. These pseudo leaves here don't have a vascular tissue, so they're not considered as real leaves. So, in terms of life cycle, which is what we focus mostly on, these plants still have the main part of the life cycle taken by the gametophyte, the haploid form. So what you're looking at here, this is how a moss will look like if you look at you enlarge a picture of the moss. So what you see here as green, this is actually the gametophyte. Okay, this is the haploid form of the plants. And the sporophyte develops out of the gametophyte, out of actually what we call the gametanja, the male and female gametanja, which are referred to as the entheridium for the male gametanja, which will be this one. The entheridium is the singular, entheridia is plural, are the gametanja, so those structures in the gametophyte that produce the gametes. So if you're talking about entheridia, you're talking about the gametanja that produce the sperm. If you're talking about instead the gametanja that produce the egg, you're talking about the female gametanja, still present in the same plant, which are referred to as archegonia. Okay, so now you would have the archegonia and entheridia here producing the sperm and the eggs, and then some plants can be bisexual, some plants can be unisexual. So the bisexual one would have separate, one would have entheridia, the other one would have archegonia. But no matter what, once fecundation of the eggs within the archegonia takes place, what you have is that the embryo, so the sporophyte, the diploid form, will grow out of the archegonia here, projected upward, and will develop this structure here, which is the sporangium. That's where they'll be producing the spore. They have a single type of spore, so the homospores. The spore will be produced here by meiosis. So the spores are haploid. The the sporophyte is diploid, but by meiosis produce haploid cells, the spores, which then will be dropped and will reform the gametophyte. This is a picture that shows you the difference between the antheridium and the archegonium. Just to remind you, the antheridium, that's the male gametangium. So that's the structure that you will find here in the plants that produce the sperm. The sperms are encapsulated within these protective layers, which will burst. The sperm in this plant has a flagellum. It's still dependent on water in order to move around. So they will be stored inside here, these protective layer in the antheridium, and only when rain comes or there is water coming, they will burst, releasing the sperm. The egg instead will be inside the female gametangium, which is referred to as the archegonium. It will be protected as well, but once the wet season comes, the sperm will allow to move finally with their flagella, would enter inside the archegonium, fertilizing the egg, producing the zygote, the early sporophyte, the first cell of the sporophyte. And then the sporophyte will start growing within the archegonium here, projecting itself outside and then producing the spore through the sporangium there. Let's focus only on mosses. So what I mentioned to you before is mostly about mosses. We'll see a picture of the actual life cycle recapitulating. I will repeat many things over and over. It will help to memorize you, particularly a name like gametangium, sporangium, antheridium, archegonium, all those things. So mosses, they do belong to the phylum of Bryophyta. They are fairly successful overall. You have about 10,000 species now present on Earth. And when we look at the life cycle, I'll show you directly on this picture, summarizing again what we already mentioned. The life cycle, again, big part of the life cycle is taken by the gametophyte. This is what you used to look at. This is a picture of peat moss, one group actually of mosses, one specific type. So this is the gametophyte. Now some gametophytes or some of plants can be bisexual, so meaning the same gametophyte will have both the male gametangium, the antheridium, and the female gametangium, which is the archegonium. Some other plants are unisexual, so you may have separate plants, some with the antheridium, some with the archegonium. Either way, so now what happens there? You have that the haploid form will have the gametangia. So by mitosis, this is already haploid, will produce haploid gametes. The sperm, again, it's water dependent. It has a flagellum, so it's protected into a cell layer, but when water comes, the cell layer will burst, releasing the sperm. And the sperm can finally transfer into the archegonium, then reaching the egg produced by the archegonium. Okay. These will be on the top of these structures here. When fertilization happens, now you have the zygote. So that's the first cell for the sporophyte, the diploid form of the plant. And this will start growing inside the archegonium and producing this long structure here, which now on the top will produce the structure, the capsule, which ultimately is what we call the sporangium, one of them, or sporangia for many of them, which is the structure where by meiosis the spores are produced. They will get released into the ground, forming first what we call a protonema, a few cell organism, which then will grow into, again, the gametophyte. Now, important things to remember for these cycles: first of all, the prevalence of the gametophyte here. Second thing, how the sporophyte is still connected ultimately to the gametophyte. We'll see when we talk about the life cycle of ferns, how at that point the sporophyte and the gametophyte will become independent, and how the two phases will start taking pretty much the same time in the overall life cycle. So this is a picture of how the sporangium of one of the mosses, sphagnum here, would look like. So you can see the spores are encapsulated. They are of a single type, so this is a homosporous type of plant. This structure is on the top of the sporophyte here, which is connected to the gametophyte on the bottom here. So let's move on now to the second group of plants that we'll talk about here, at least on the first part. Then I'll stop, I'll pause for a moment, and then we'll finish up on the second part talking about gymnosperm and angiosperms. So the second group we talk about here is a group that has evolved around 425 million years ago, fairly successful. Lots of these plants are still around. Ferns, for example, you can see them around. Club mosses are still around. And this group is referred to as seedless vascular plants because they have vasculature now, but they still do not produce a seed. So these are the first vascular plants appearing on land. Okay, they were very dominant well past the evolution or the starting point of gymnosperm and angiosperm, and it's still very, very, very well spread throughout the earth. Now, being in between non-vascular plants and vascular seed plants, they tend to have characteristic of both groups. So, for example, they're very similar to bryophytes in the fact that they still need, most of them still need moist environments. The reason being, not only so they can manage water much better now, but they still have a swimming sperm. The sperm is still a flagellum, is not airborne, is not encapsulated into pollen. It still needs water to move around. And they still reproduce to spores, okay, which again, they're not encapsulated into seeds. They're vascular seedless plants. But now they start having also some similarity to more evolved plants. Well, they have a vascular system, which now would have the xylem and the phloem. As following up here, these gave them the chance to grow much taller in structure. They gave them a chance also to develop roots, proper roots, at least some of them. Another big feature I already anticipated when I talked about the moss life cycle is that the sporophyte now, so the diploid form, becomes independent from the gametophyte. Not only that, but also start existing for a longer period of time within the overall life cycle. Finally, other big features that they share with seed plants, so gymnosperm and angiosperms, is the plants start becoming heterosporous. So they start producing two types of spores, microspore and megaspores, which will lead to the formation of a male and female gametophytes. So giving a higher chance of mixing genetic pools in the long run. Now, seedless vascular plants, they do include two phyla, the Lycophyta. So they are club mosses. Don't be deceived by the name. They're very different than the mosses belonging to bryophytes. Again, they tend to be earlier plants, earlier type of seedless vascular plants. So they tend to be still fairly small, even though some original one, which now don't exist anymore, they could have been actually fairly tall. But the current ones tend to be small. They have very small and simple leaves, like needle-like. And then they start having, though, true roots, very simple vascular tissue, but they start being efficient and moving both nutrients and the product of photosynthesis around. They tend to live mostly in wet or shady habitats, still need fairly humid environments. The second group is the Pterophyta, which includes ferns, horsetails, and other plants as well. These are the most diffuse one. They're extremely successful still nowadays. Okay, it's the second most successful group beside angiosperm, the flowering plants. And at this point, they start having much more complex type of leaves that they are divided. Think about ferns. You know exactly what I mean by that. And now they start actually conquering also some more arid type of environments too. This picture just shows you how early lycophytes would have looked. This is actually not a picture. This is just a painting that shows you how lycophytes could actually be growing very, very tall. These are early vascular seedless plants, but they could grow several meters high. Okay, they were very efficient. Here you can see other example of vascular seedless plants, the ferns. So this is how a forest would have looked about probably 400 million years, about 400 million years ago, with lycophyte appearing and seed ferns and so on. So let's talk about the first of the two phyla that make up vascular seedless plants, so Lycophyta. Some of them, you might see them. They're very common. These plants, you can see them commonly here, even in Ontario. You go for a walk in the forest, I'm sure you can recognize them. So lycophytes are also referred to as club mosses. Again, don't get deceived by the name. They're very different than mosses. Now, these plants, they start having roots, okay? And they start having lignin being produced. So they start producing longer type of stems. Not only that, but they have roots that can bring in a lot of material now from the ground and give them anchoring, excellent anchoring throughout this. Now, another very interesting feature of Lycophyta, which you'll see enhanced in gymnosperms later on, is that now these plants that start having, first of all, some simple type of leaves which have vasculature inside. So they're real needle-like type of leaves here, which some of them, they tend to cluster together, specializing in the production ultimately of spores. The leaves that cluster together, so each one of these green things you see here are referred to as sporophylls. When they cluster together, they form structures which are referred to as strobilus or cone. I'm sure that the first thing that comes up to you is what you see in conifers. These are not conifers, they're not gymnosperms, they're lycophytes. They're still less evolved than gymnosperms. But they start having these structures which now will contain the sporangium. So this is the sporophyte. The sporangium will be here. That's where the sporophyte, the spore, will be produced within the sporangium. So they start having dedicated structures to produce the spores within the sporangium, which then will be released on the ground. Now, most of these plants now, and that's the picture that I showed you in the previous lecture, showing the difference between micro and megaspores, was actually from one of the Lycophyta plants. I think it was exactly from Lycopodium. And so there tend to be, some of them start becoming heterospores as well, but most are still homospores between these plants. So some of them become heterospores. Second phylum belonging to vascular seedless plants is the Pterophyta. This includes a series of plants that you already are very familiar with, like ferns. There's lots of different type of ferns. Very successful plants. You see lots of them here in Ontario. But there are other plants including this group as well, such as whisk ferns. These are plants that don't have leaves. Okay, they actually do photosynthesis with their own stem. This is the sporophyte. These are the sporangium. You will see that. And the third group is hortails. Don't mix them up with cattails. Cattails are actually flowering plants. So they are angiosperm. They are not vascular seedless plants. So this group has been extremely successful, competing with angiosperms overall in terms of number of species present on Earth nowadays. So when it comes to whisk ferns, they're still very primitive type of plants. As I said before, they don't have true roots, but they don't have particularly leaves. That's what I mentioned before. They don't have true leaves. They don't even have true roots. They still have rhizoids. These structures that still form mycorrhizal with fungi on the ground in order to get some nutrients. They don't anchor very well. What anchors very well them is the rhizome. These plants, they have this structure which actually is underground, but it still belongs to the stem. It's a horizontal part of the stem that connects all the vertical stem together underground. These are, one example is ginger actually has a rhizome. It's not a vascular seedless plant, but it's one of those, just to give you a reference on what they are. These rhizomes are what makes lots of these plants very hard to actually remove from the ground, because you can pull some of these plants out here, but then the rhizome is still underground. The plants can still come out in other areas as well, or come back here because they haven't broken the connection on the rhizome, or we have not removed the whole rhizome here. So they don't have real leaves, they don't have true roots. The photosynthesis is performed by the stem itself. They still rely on fungi, but now they start having a good vascular system in place, consisting of both xylem and phloem. So xylem to move the nutrients and water, phloem to move actually now the organic compounds product ultimately of photosynthesis. The second group is the one that includes, so ferns are, the second group within the pterophyta plants is the ferns right here. So these are again plants you're very familiar with. Plants that consist both of a sporophyte and a gametophyte in their life cycle. The one you're used to recognize all the time is the sporophyte. What you see right here, that's what we associate with ferns, is indeed the sporophyte. So the diploid form. Now these plants start having leaves. Leaves that are nicely divided, they're vascularized, so there are real leaves here. They're referred to as fronds. When you look at the sporophyte, now the sporangia, so the structure that produce spore, are actually hidden underneath these leaves here. They are clustered together in structure referred to as sori, plural. A sorus is a one, sori or sori. Sori will be the correct name in Latin, sori probably is in English. They cluster together in this structure here underneath. And that's where the spores are produced and then released to the ground, where they will form an independent gametophyte. The gametophyte and the sporophyte are independent organisms here. And now you have that the gametophyte will produce the antheridium and archegonium on the underside. The same one will produce both. They tend to be homosporous as well. So looking at the life cycle here, it's going straight. This slide here summarizes what it is. The big changes, and that's what I want you to take home again as part of this lecture, is the big change from the bryophytes. What are the big changes here? Well, the first big change is that now the haploid, so the gametophyte phase, and the diploid phase start taking pretty much the same time throughout the life cycle. In the bryophytes, and I repeat it over and over, the haploid form, the gametophyte, was prevalent compared to the diploid form. Second thing is that now you start having separation between the diploid, so the sporophyte, and the haploid, the gametophyte. They are actually independent organisms. In fact, they look very different. So this is the sporophyte, what we always recognize as fern. This is the gametophyte, something that grows in proximity of the sporophyte, but is much more smaller type of leaves. Okay. So going through the life cycle. So here you have the sporophyte. Okay, it has a rhizome. Start having real roots. This looks a rhizoid, but actually real roots here, and several stems coming out of the rhizome here. It has the sporangia clustered into the sori under the leaves here, and here the spores are produced by meiosis, and then they get released on the ground. Here they grow to form a plant, still a fern, but it's haploid. This is the gametophyte. The gametophyte here would have both the male, well, in this picture will be the female archegonium, the female gametangium, so the archegonium, which then will produce the egg, and then the male gametangium, which will be the antheridium, which will produce the sperm. Like in mosses, the sperm is still encapsulated within the antheridium and is still has a flagellum, still relies on water to move. So when water comes in the form of moisture, rain, then the sperm can actually burst out of the protective cell layer here and fertilize the egg within the archegonium. The early sporophyte start actually growing as well here out of the archegonium. So at the beginning, you would have some sort of hybrid diploid, so the sporophyte, and haploid plants corresponding to the gametophyte. But in the long run, the gametophyte dies and the sporophyte form a full plant, which then will restart the cycle as described before. So I'm gonna stop here for the first part. So we talked about the non-vascular plants, so bryophytes, and then we talk about vascular and seedless plants. In the next part, I'll be talking about the vascular seed plants, so including gymnosperms and angiosperms.